Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Fishing with James. This is episode 16 of my hand-tied jig series, and today I'm going to be showing you how to tie two Super Bowl themed crappie jigs. So let's go ahead and get started. So starting out with the Eagles themed jig head, I have a 1/8 ounce ball head jig head. I've painted it with a smoke base paint with candy green on top of it, and I think I've really matched that kind of teal green color. So starting out, I'm just going to apply a little bit of super glue onto the hook. Then I'm going to lay down a nice coat of thread. I'm using Danville's 210 denier flat wax nylon, and I'm just going to be using black thread today. Once I've got that done, I'm just going to pad up any extra super glue with a paper towel and cut the tag end of the thread. For the tail for this jig, I'm going to be using a white Marabou feather. I want it to be about the length of the hook, and once I have it sized up, I'm just going to put it down on the hook and begin tightly wrapping thread onto the feather to tie it in. After that, I'm just going to take my thread and begin wrapping it very tightly all the way up to the head of the jig, and then I'm just going to cut off the tag end of the feather as close as I can to the hook. Next, I'm just going to wrap a little bit more thread onto the feather just to make sure I have it tied in all the way. For the flash for this jig, I'm going to be using some black crystal flash. This will give it a nice contrast in the tail. For sizing, I take one full strand and cut it in half, and then cut that strand in half again and double it. Then I'm going to lay it on the hook and tie some thread around it and rotate it 90 degrees so that way it's exactly on both sides of the jig. Then I'm going to wrap thread all the way down even with the point of the hook and back up to the head. For sizing on the tinsel to the tail, I just want to cut it right past the feather, just like that. Now for the body, I'm going to be using some Christmas tree crystal chenille. This is as close to the right green as I could get. So I'm going to start out by tying the chenille in at the head and wrapping thread all the way down even with where I've wrapped everything else. And then I'm going to take my thread and go back up to the head and set it off to the side. Now I'm just going to use the rotary function on my vise to wrap the chenille all the way up to the head of the jig. You want to make sure it stays even all the way up. Just like this. I'm going to do one more to make it even. And there we go. Now I'm just going to wrap thread under and over the chenille, even with the head, just to tie it in. This is not an exact science. You just want to make sure your chenille's tied in tightly. Now I'm just going to take my scissors and cut the tag end of the chenille. Then I'm going to take my whip finishing tool and do a double whip finish. So we're going to do a handful of wraps for the first time, pull it tight, and then a handful of wraps around a second time and pull that tight as well. Then we're just going to take our scissors and cut the tag end of the thread. So now that we have the Eagles crappie jig done, let's move on to the Chiefs crappie jig. So the same thing as the other one, I've got a 1/8 ounce ball head jig head and I've painted it with some ruby slipper powder paint. First I'm going to add my glue and then my thread. The tail on this one's going to be multicolored, so the first base color for the tail I'm going to have is a red Marabou feather. So again, same thing as the other one, I want it to be about the length of the hook. Once I have it sized, I'm going to tightly wrap it into the hook, and then I'm just going to tie it in. The second color in the tail is going to be white, so I'm just going to use a tiny bit of a Marabou feather and wrap it in as well very tightly. I just want a tiny little bit of white, so it's going to be kind of a spot there, about half the length of the tail. Once I've got that tied in, it's going to be time for flash. For this jig, I'm going to be using some gold crystal flash. It'll give it a nice gold hint in the tail. So I'm going to tie it in just like the last one. And if you guys notice, I'm speeding this one up just because they're the same steps as the other jig. I just want you guys to be able to see kind of my thought process and how this jig comes together. For the body, I'm going to be using some gold crystal flash. So I'm just going to take the strand and tie it in at the head and wrap thread even with everything else. And wrap my thread up to the head and set it off to the side. This chenille is really small, so it's going to take a lot of wrapping to be able to get it in all the way. You can hold it back with your finger to save material, but I just wanted to get it done. So I'm just going to wrap it all the way up until it's at the head and it's even. Then I'm just going to take my thread and go under and over the chenille to tie it in, just like before. Then I'm just going to take my scissors and cut the tag end of the chenille and pull out any fuzzy bits that stay behind. So now for a double whip finish, I'm going to do 4 or 5 wraps on the first time, pull it tight, and another 4 or 5 wraps for a second time, and pull it tight. Then I'm just going to cut the thread, and there you have it, a Chiefs themed crappie jig. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave it a like and subscribe if you're new, and I will see you all in the next episode of Hand Tied Jigs.